So this week we're looking at cost plus inflation. Is it a thing? It is being used right now as the excuse for why we are starting in many parts of the world to seeing inflation starting to kick back up again. Everyone was thinking it's all down now since the pandemic. Okay, we had all those supply chains. They've basically sorted themselves out. Now inflation is rising again. Let's blame it on wages because they've been rising because everyone's been trying to claim wages back for all the money that they've lost over the last few years. So let's blame that. And Steve, an argument often given for wage plus inflation is actually to look at when it didn't happen, which is like the 10 years before the pandemic, when we didn't see wages go up. We didn't see GDP go up either, or productivity. Everything was just staying down at close to zero. But wages didn't go up, and therefore inflation didn't go up. Therefore, you know, it's almost like the negative argument about wage plus inflation. When we don't get wages going up, we don't get inflation. So therefore, when wages do go up, we must get inflation. So is there anything in it? I mean, surely sometimes it does make sense that actually if wages go higher than productivity gains, then that will get passed on to prices, and companies, if they don't absorb it, will mean that prices go up and we do get inflation.
Yeah, I mean, the cost plus inflation is far more sensible than what neoclassicals. Can I use the word wank in this expression? Wank on about. Sorry. Okay. They're bankers, wankers.
If you started as you mean to go on, just calm it down.
Sorry,
please get over it. You don't like them very much. Leave it.
Okay. The thing is, the argument that neoclassical make, and Austrians as well, is that, and Milton Friedman first promulgated it too, and that is that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, and that this says as you put up increase the money supply, you're going to increase prices. Bang, that's the argument. Okay, now this is not the same argument. This is saying that it isn't, and this is a bit like I'm going to take on the National Rifle Association slogan here when they say that it isn't guns don't kill people, people kill people. Well, leave that as it may. My mapping of that across to the monetary system is increasing the money supply doesn't cause inflation, people cause inflation. And the two sets of people that can cause inflation, when you look at the broad sweep of a capitalist economy, are workers or capitalists. Workers can cause inflation by insisting on money wage increases, and capitalists can cause it by putting up their markups. And in that world, the money, sometimes the amount of money being created facilitates that, but normally what happens is the amount of money being created reacts to that. So in fact, rather than increasing a money supply causing inflation, inflation causes increases in the money supply. And we saw that in the 1970s when the oil price shock came through. Now, that was a productivity thing in a sense, because when the Seven Sisters, as they were known, the seven major oil companies, BP, Shell, Aramco, etc. There was Aramco, or I've forgotten the American one, but about seven companies.
Yeah, Aramco.
Seven companies dominated oil exploitation from Arabia. Then after the Yom Kippur War, the OPEC formed, and they basically said anybody who supported Israel are going to get a boycott, and that caused a fourfold increase in the price of oil. Now, what that did, the money supply was that, and this is the arguments about money inflation being cost push, came out of post-Keynesian economists at much the same time. And the argument of Basil Moore was that when there's an increase in the material costs for production, and that was like a fourfold increase in the price of oil virtually overnight from $2.50 a barrel to $10, companies had lines of credit, which are a bit like credit cards for in ordinary humans. And when there's an increase in the price of oil, they access those lines of credit. And that, because that increased level of private debt, it increased the amount of money as well. So causation goes in the opposite direction to what the money thing argues. So whereas the cost of production argument pretty much comes back to Mikhail Kalecki's analysis of saying you can start off from saying that you've got real output and nominal output is a price level times real output, and you then say, well, real output involves production, workers times the number of workers working times the number of the amount of commodity produced per worker. And he finally derived a three-factor argument for what causes inflation, and that was increasing money wages, increasing markups by firms on money wages, and then the negative contribution, that they reduced the rate of inflation, was increases in output per worker. And that that's like a logical,
Which is like
based on the
productivity
data.
gains.
Your productivity gains, if productivity increases are the same as money wage increases, and firms don't change their markups, then you get zero inflation. But you can get positive inflation when firms respond to workers getting larger money wages by putting up their markups as well on those money wages. Then you get a conflict over the distribution of income, and that's what causes inflation. The monetary system accommodates that, it doesn't limit it. So when you look at it this way, it's to say that yes, they say the money wages are causing inflation, you say, yeah, that can be true, because the rate of increase in money wages can be greater than the rate of increase in output per worker. And when you have that happen, then money wages will come through as a cause of inflation. And particularly if firms respond to the increase in money wages by also putting up their markups. And so you get this contest that causes the inflation. And the money supply, because 90% of the money supply is created by the private sector, not by the government, the private sector accommodates that. So you get increasing money supply coming out of conflict over the distribution of income, which leads to increasing money wages from workers if they've got the muscle to be able to do that with low unemployment, and increasing markups by firms if they think they can get away with increasing the markup because everybody else is doing it at the same time.
So, of course, central banks and a lot of economists say, well, okay, how do we know, when wages are going to go up? And so they basically assume wages will be dependent on the tightness of the labour market. So if there's lots of jobs available, it's easy for people to move jobs, therefore they're going to demand higher wages. If there's less jobs available, they're going to stick where they are and they'll just accept, no wage increase because that's better than not having a job at all. So, I mean, again, that's logical, isn't it? It's just that it sort of seems to form the foundation right now for everything that central banks are looking at.
Yeah, but it's you're actually giving them more credit than they deserve on that front, because when it comes down, that's a sort of logical deduction saying that if there's a low level of unemployment and the workers have got high bargaining power, they can use that high bargaining power to get money wage increases, that'll cause inflation. And that's moderately logical argument about how a tight labour market can cause money wages to rise. But the other, what the central banks are actually thinking is that they're affecting the decisions of the representative agent, otherwise known as the infinitely knowledgeable consumer, because their models of what causes changes in economic activity say that increasing the interest rate makes it more desirable for households to consume less now and save because they get a higher return. And so what they think they're doing by putting up interest rates is encouraging consumers to consume less. That's the logic they've got behind their increases in the rate of interest. And there's so many ways in which they make mistakes about this, because the interest rate they're actually putting up is the interest rate on bonds. It's not the interest rate on private loans. And the interest rate on bonds is money created by the government that goes to people who own those bonds. And the people who own those bonds fundamentally are non-bank financial institutions, pension funds, superannuation funds, so on and so forth. That actually boosts, and rich individuals who buy bonds as a safe investment, that actually boosts their consumption capability. So you're trying to reduce consumption by boosting the amount of money people have got to consume. Now, of course, it's going to the wealthy, so they tend to consume asset prices, and you get asset price bubbles rather than consumer price bubbles coming out of it. But the central banks,
exactly.
It's like you're giving a little...
talked about last week or the week before.
Yeah, you want to shut your child up, so you give them a little plastic wheel that's attached to the car, and you tell them that they move that's going to move the car. So rather than saying, "Are we there yet, Daddy?" they play with the wheel and they think they're doing something useful. Right. That's central banks.
Right. Okay. Good. Well, that would be good. I mean, they're not in the driving seat. That might be a benefit to everybody. But
that's right. I mean, that's why. But the trouble is, they are in the driver's seat, and they think they're changing where the car is going by varying.
Yeah.
with a plastic wheel. And what they're doing is actually boosting inequality, increasing the amount of money going to the wealthy, causing asset price inflation, and they think they're controlling consumer price inflation.
Right, but I want to have a look at this connection, though, between, say, you're in a situation where there's loads of jobs available. And here's an interesting stat. In the United States right now, the wage increase for job stayers over the last year is 4%. Overall, the wages have increased by 4.1%. So central banks are very worried that that's too high. It is higher than it was for years before the pandemic. So it is, relatively speaking, 4.1% is quite a high increase in wages. But for job switchers, it's 6.5%. So you get, and it stands to reason because you'd be promoted, you're going into a new job. And so they want to see less job switches. They want a tight labour market because that means people are, they want a low hiring regime, which is arguably where we are now. But those people who are moving on are getting paid higher wages. So, okay, people are getting paid less, comparatively speaking. They're seeing less growth. If that is having an impact on inflation, what impact will interest rates have on that dynamic at all?
Well, to say, this is actually one of Warren Mosler's new points that I agree with. There's a lot of Warren stuff I don't agree with. But it only applies to new bonds as well. But his point was that if you have a level of government debt approaching 100% of GDP, which is where we are right now, that a lot of that's owned by other government sectors, so it's not as high as it appears to be in the American case, but it's still, more than 50% of GDP, let's say. But this is 100% for a indicator. If you have debt level of 100% of GDP and you've got bonds outstanding which are equivalent to 100% of GDP and they're paying 5% yield, then you're adding 5% of aggregate demand to the economy by putting up interest rates to 5%. So when interest rates were 1%, which was what happened before the pandemic, then even like a 100% of GDP debt level, government debt level, would only translate into 1% of GDP money creation. So putting up the interest rate actually stimulates demand rather than reducing it. But it stimulates demand for those who own bonds, which is at the upper end of the income distribution.
Which actually might be those people who are managing to get, in a persuasive position to actually get a 6.5% pay increase. They might have nice little nest eggs, which are, filled with those bonds, perhaps. I don't know. But it's
there's more the capitalists who got the bonds than the workers in that front. But it's okay. But that's the positive side. The negative side, which I haven't seen Warren factor in, but it's extremely important, is that only applies to the 5% yield is like a face value yield, only applies to the new bonds which are being issued to cover the current deficit. And they'll have all sorts of terms, between 1 year and 30-year bonds will be issued, depending on whatever maturity transformations the government wants to do. But existing bonds, which 30-year bonds, which will put out when the rate of interest is 1%, and you now have the interest rate of 5%, those bonds are only giving you $10 a year for a face value of 1,000, so the face value crashes. And what you get is a dramatic fall in the value of the assets that banks have on their books, and this is what caused Silicon Valley Bank to go under. So what the central banks think is controlling the inflation rate is actually making the financial system more fragile.
So what do you think is happening right now then? Because we have got the inflation in many parts of the world is starting to tick up again. So the US has got an inflation rate of 3%. Now you could say, well, that stands to reason because tariffs are pushing prices up, but actually the import price levels have increased by only 1.6%. On average, mainly because the impact of tariffs has been offset by drops in the price of fuel, of energy, so energy costs have come down. But wages in the US have risen by 4.1%. So, that sort of stands to the argument, doesn't it? Well, actually, wages are starting to, wages more than import prices, more than tariffs, might actually be what is causing this tick up in inflation. But you'd be thinking, is that a long-term thing? Do you need to react to that? Or is that just markets trying to, regain some of the ground, like the young doctors have been doing in the UK?
Yeah, when you look over the long term, wages as a share of GDP hit their maximums about 1973, and they've been heading down ever since. Like part of this, my analysis of private debt actually shows that rising levels of private debt cause a fall in the workers' share of GDP, not the capitalists who are in the firms are borrowing. Even if the firms are borrowing the money and spending it to build factories, which is exactly what you'd want firms to do, even in that situation, the increase in debt, which would be the corporate sector borrowing the money and putting it to real factories, that ends up reducing the amount of income going to workers, not to the capitalists. So what you get is rising level of private debt means workers get less money, less of GDP. So if there was any capacity for workers to organise, then they'd be demanding wage rises. Now, of course, over the last 50 years, and again under the pressure of neoliberal governments and left Labor and Liberal parties, regardless of their Labor and Conservative, despite their labels, all have done the same sort of economic policies. They've undermined the labour trade union movements. The trade unions can't bargain now. There aren't, I don't know what the coverage of trade unions is right now in America.
But
certainly the order of 10%.
But would they have? Yeah, I don't know. But
they can't bargain.
But increasingly they wouldn't have been able to anyway, would they? Because there's so much automation.
That's right.
and mechanisation.
So what it means is that workers can't do anything until there's a tight labour market, and then that stat you explained earlier, where there's 4% wage rises for people who maintain their jobs and 6% for those who swap. That is actually not the unions demanding wage rises because they've been abolished. If you had the trade unions in there, you'd be getting like an average of 5%, let's say. But what you're getting is 4% for those who stay with the company and 6% for those who swap. It's the capitalist offering higher wages to try to attract people away from other firms that already have those workers. So you get a spiky. The destruction of the trade union movement means that when inflation comes through from the wages side of things, it'll tend to be out of the blue. Get to a certain point of pressure where it's not the workers who think have got bargaining power now and the union rep can go along and bargain for a larger money wage. It's the capitalists trying to staff and they find they can't get the staff, so they whack up the wage levels or try to recruit people and effectively take them away from existing jobs. So it makes the abolishing the trade union movement has made inflation more spiky than it was when we had strong trade unions.
Yeah, okay, but you also have the automation aspect of it as well. So there's fewer jobs.
Automation as well, yeah.
And so in the manufacturing sector, about a quarter of the cost of production is labour now. So even if everybody said, well, we demand a 10% wage increase, you're actually only going to increase the price by 2.5%, which you can actually argue.
2.5%, yeah.
You could argue that's actually quite a good thing because then people have got 10% more money. Prices have gone up by 2.5%, and maybe companies say, "Well, we'll absorb a chunk of that, perhaps in a ideal world." But people have got more money; they've got 10% more money. They can buy more. You'd argue by that rationale, that's actually a productive outcome for everybody, isn't it?
And this is also one little thing that I've just not rediscovered, but re-exposed fundamentally, is that conventional economic theory says that the cost of production per unit goes up as you go into a boom. And that is contradicted. Post-Keynesian position is that as you increase capacity utilisation, per unit costs actually fall because you don't have this idea of rising marginal cost. Not economies of scale. This is a mistake that the neoclassicals make when they try to challenge this argument. You're using more of your existing capacity. You always have spare capacity. The neoclassical myth of rising marginal cost comes out of the belief that you're operating beyond the ideal capacity for your machines. You've got more workers per machine than is actually ideal. That's the basis of diminishing marginal productivity. So like capacity utilisation in a neoclassical way of thinking is always 110, 120, 130%. In fact, it's 70, 80, 90%. And if you can boost the capacity and you have constant per unit variable costs, your fixed costs fall, that actually means that an increase in economic activity reduces the inflationary pressures. And of all people, two of the most conservative economists going, Kydland and Prescott, who are two of the people who gave us real business cycle models and the whole basis of how central banks behave these days, they did a very nice piece of empirical work back in 1990 called Real Facts in a Monetary Myth. On business cycles, and they said that prices are actually anti-cyclical. An increase in economic activity reduces the rate of inflation. So we've got this strange dynamic come out. The thing that I think is actually probably having a pressure and causing a lot of that inflationary pressure is that when you look at output per worker, what you're fundamentally looking at is the energy costs. It's usually said 25% is wages these days. If we start getting more expensive energy, then it's harder. It's more expensive to use energy to convert inputs into raw materials into outputs, and you're likely to get an increase in the cost of production coming out of that, with energy becoming tighter, as it's happening to some extent, certainly with fossil fuel production, when you have to use fracking to access the oil rather than more conventional methods, and you have a tightness of demand on the fossil fuel front, that's going to cause inflation.
Yeah. So because we're basing productivity based on the output per hour worked as a monetary value, rather than looking at the outputs in terms of units produced. So I think what you're saying is you could have workers still producing the same amount of stuff and maybe even increasing slightly, but the cost of it has increased so much because of the energy input. So therefore, as far as productivity is seen, that's seen as a decline in productivity. But in fact, people are producing more. That's the crazy thing, isn't it? But that scenario, and we're about to go to a break, so you don't need to remind me this time, Steve. And I want to talk about Japan when we come back. But I mean, that scenario I gave where everyone asked for 10% more, and the company goes, okay, well, that means it's going to cost us 2.5% more because you're a quarter of all the cost of our production. But you have 10% more, therefore you're demanding 10% more. Your argument is, which seems bleeding obvious to me and anybody who's ever run a business, obviously, if you've got more people buying stuff and you've got a factory that you've paid for, and it's not at full capacity, then your fixed costs are reduced, divided by this increase in production. You've just got your variable costs, which, your fixed cost for a factory is probably the largest part of, inputs like energy, as you talk about.
Truly,
would be a significant part of all of that as well. But you'd have a bigger market for your goods, and you'd have a lower cost per unit. So everybody wins in that scenario. So sometimes wage increases are good, aren't they? We need a certain level of inflation. And on that, we'll come back and talk about Japan, because they needed it and they got it. And Nikkei is now the fastest growing, not that it's a measure of everything, but it's the fastest growing share market currently because of all of this. When we come back on the Debunking Economics podcast. So, Steve, Japan is an interesting case, isn't it? Because for 10 years, Japan just sat there. Nothing was happening. The economy, GDP was zero or negative. Inflation was not going anywhere. More to the point, wages weren't going anywhere. And it was explained to me that, in Japan, people are never going to ask for a wage increase if nothing else is increasing, because it would just be disrespectful to the nation. But the moment that inflation started to tick up, all of a sudden, or the moment interest rates started to rise as well, the moment there was any movement whatsoever, it got to a position where people could actually ask for increased wages. And companies like that, because all of a sudden they go, well, people are getting paid more. This is great because now we can invest because people have got more money to spend to buy our stuff. So actually, the Japanese economy has been kick-started by inflation and rising wages. It's actually created a situation where they've now got growth.
Yeah, and this is one of the...
Is that how you see it?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things which Richard Goodwin covered very well when he developed his growth cycle model, and that was that when you look at the relationship between workers and capitalists, wages rise because of rising output per worker. But output per worker is not the case of the cappuccino maker making 3 cappuccinos at once rather than 2, which is what it looks like when you say labour productivity. Yeah. It's you produce machines that produce more output than you used to make with the previous number of workers. You have less workers per machine, but more energy throughput in that machine itself. So it's not the machines getting more productive that gives you growth, it's not the workers getting more productive that gives you increases in labour productivity. It's the machines they're using becoming needing less workers given the energy that the machine can process. So you need the firms to be investing. Now, with the situation for Japan, they were the canary in the coal mine. If we'd actually had a sensible discipline of economics, we would have seen, Japan had a bubble of too much private debt, a speculative bubble in real estate and share markets in 1980. That ruined the economy. Firms ended up with far too much private debt because the Japanese keiretsu system relies a lot more on debt finance than equity finance. There's been less investment. That's why the economy has been stultified for so long. Now, if you have wage rises, and this was Goodwin's point, the wage rises are enabled by the technology, but the wage rises also encourage developing that technology. So if you have a situation where there are low wages and low growth in wages, then there's no encouragement of capitalists to invest in new technology, which reduces wage costs because, hey, they're low anyway. So to some extent, getting innovation is a product of having a high share going to workers. And when you look back at the evolution of the beginning of the industrial system, like the spinning jenny, for example, that meant initially that one person working a spinning wheel was replaced by one person working 6 spinning wheels. And then, of course, the number of spinning wheels rose and rose and rose over time. But I've forgotten the academic who did it, but someone did a comparison of Scotland versus France and asking, why did the Industrial Revolution happening in Scotland? Why did the spinning jenny get invented there rather than France, for example? And the reason came down to the fact that the wages in France were so much lower that it wasn't worth replacing 6 workers with a machine because the machine was more expensive than the 6 workers. But in the case of Scotland, with higher wages, reducing the 6 workers actually was a good deal for the capitalists who bought the spinning jenny. So the technological development occurred where wages were high, not where wages are low.
I'm not sure where this takes us, though, in the age of AI. If AI is going to do everything, and
this is the other danger that
leg to stand on.
You don't. Well, no legs necessary. I mean, this is, I think, the big challenge we face in the future, apart from global warming, which is going to derail everything else. But if the robotics gets to the stage where the manual dexterity of a robot with hands is equivalent to that of a human, then you don't need workers to be process workers on production lines anymore, and you then can dramatically reduce the amount of labour going in, but that then comes back on the other side. Who are you going to sell to? And so you get this real macroeconomic issue that if we really push the technological thrust we've got at the moment with AI and robotics, then you're going to destroy the macroeconomy. You've got to find some other way to generate aggregate demand.
Yeah. And unions or not makes no difference in that scenario. And however much you agree that people get paid by whatever means, the ability to see an increase in that wage just isn't going to be there, is it? So, you could say, okay, well, if wages are driving inflation in this future environment, there's going to be no inflation. There'll be a lot of poverty, but there'll be no inflation because what would be driving up prices? Well,
this is why quite a few of the tech bros who are thinking about this have actually kind of, hey, maybe we need a universal basic income. Yeah. And I've literally had contacts from some people in this field who are pushing the whole AI and robotics and so on, and they've realised, and I think it actually even turns up in Elon Musk's thinking, which to me is a bit of a surprise these days, given the other nonsense he's come up with, that if you don't have universal basic income, then the vast majority of people who don't own the means of production won't be needed for production, and therefore you're going to have a poverty-stricken world, and the only way around that is a universal basic income, and that comes back to the state providing the income for people to buy, not corporations, because they won't need the workers in the first place.
But people will get. I mean, that'll be like a set wage, though, won't it? You're not going to have. There's no ability, absolutely zero ability for anybody to say.
Well, it means the bargaining
power. I want my wages to go up,
the
unless
bargaining
power on the streets. That's the that's the only thing.
Yeah, like the bargaining power workers used to have with unions and now have with tight labour markets when firms are forced to poach employees from other firms by putting up high wages for job switches. In this robotic future, then the only bargaining tool you're going to have is political power, not union power, because you need a union of people who don't have a job, and that's. So there are real dilemmas in this future world. It's also at the same time, in some ways, it's the ideal humanity has aspired to, that we could all live lives of leisure and still produce output. That's feasible in that world, but then it becomes a question of where does the buying power come from that? And we're relying upon a class-based income system and workers versus capitalists and all those sorts of competitive behaviours between social classes. That's what's given us relative stability over time in terms of bringing about high income, high consumption economies. But AI and robotics could undermine all of that. So you simply have, if you're going to have anything like a decent society as opposed to the Hunger Games, then you've got to have an income distribution system that comes from the state rather than from private capitalists.
So, but if it would be an environment of no inflation, wouldn't it? I mean, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, it's an economy driven by whatever the tech bros, however the tech bros want to manage it, isn't it?
You're still going to get relative price change. I mean, what you'd lose is the pressure that Koleski identified, where we know workers are necessary for output, and therefore they get bargaining power when there's low levels of unemployment. That'd be gone. So that particular pressure would be absent. But it's then a question of what markup are the tech bros putting on their goods to get a profit for them, and is there a market for them to sell into? And there's only a market for them to sell into if there's some other way that people can get an income. So then you'd get contests over how much the UBI is versus, what's the headroom if you don't rely upon the universal basic income for your spending power, but you try to earn more than that. Then you're going to get, entrepreneurial behaviour by some individuals. But yeah, it's going to. Inflation will still be an issue because you've still got the issue of how much of a markup the firms put on, and then also how much is that reduced by increasing output per worker or output, and that comes down to energy throughputs. So it's quite possible if we live in a world with diminishing energy productivity, and this is the argument of the peak oil advocates, that it's getting harder and harder to get fossil fuels out of the ground, particularly oil. So if we've still got an oil-based economy, then the cost of production of oil is going to rise, and that'll pass through to everything else because everything else needs energy.
What I find curious is when central banks and economists generally start looking at the inflation impacts of public sector workers. Like, for example, the fact that the young doctors who got a 6% pay increase in 2023, and then they got, they got a £1,250 one-off payment as well. Then they got a 4% increase a year later and a £750 one-off payment. And their argument was that since 2010, in real terms, their wages have gone down by 15 to 18%. So they were trying to make up some of those losses. So there's a big concern that, well, if you do that, then other public sector workers are going to expect the same thing. They're going to want to make up for the ground that they've lost. And all of that is going to be inflationary, which is curious, isn't it? Because the whole argument about inflation is that it pushes prices up.
No.
But my point was,
it's not true because they're not selling anything.
Exactly. There's no point. There's no price at the end to go up. So how do you make that point?
Yeah, because like with the doctors, I mean, well, the higher wage for the doctors means more money creation by the state. In terms of the cost, it actually reduces the cost for people because rather than having to pay the American health system, where you've got to pay a fortune to get a bottle of aspirin, in the UK you go in for eye surgery and you don't get charged for it. So it actually puts deflationary pressure. I mean, this is what I was horrified when I found out what the wages were for workers only, for medical, for fully qualified junior doctors. I was used to the Australian system when I moved to the UK, and like if you're a doctor, you earn very good salary. Even with the Medicare system in Australia, the salary ended up being extremely good. In the UK, it's dreadful. Yeah. So, and I can fully understand those doctors saying we did 6 years of low pay university, and then you want us to get 60 years of low pay when we become doctors. It becomes something which I can understand the frustration they feel.
No doubt,
but in fact, it's reducing cost pressure on everybody else,
and therefore no price pressures. So it's not an inflationary issue. But unless it spins off into expectations in the private sector for wage increases as well. But so two people you love, Blanchard and Ben Bernanke, the Bernanke-Blanchard model.
Oh dear, the BBs. Okay.
Supposedly looks at predicting inflation based on labour market tightness, fair enough, productivity, fair enough, alongside inflation expectations, which we haven't talked about, But the argument which central banks and a lot of economists use is if inflation expectations are high, then people preemptively are going to ask for a pay increase. And companies preemptively perhaps are also going to increase their prices. So banks talk about whether inflation expectations are anchored or not. And if they're unanchored, then all hell is going to break loose, and therefore they need to react to that by putting up interest rates. Is there any, I mean, I guess human psychology is something you've got to be aware of. And if, and very often I think, people will look and go, well, inflation is going to go up because we just see it going up. And it's going up in the United States, and we've got tariffs, and we've got and so you could see people going, the world's maybe not, for a whole variety of reasons, people might go, well, it looks like inflation is going to go up, and therefore it will. Do you think there's an argument for that? The whole predicting the future.
I've read it in quite a few nursery, good nursery rhymes books have got similar arguments. I mean, it's a childish theory of inflation. Inflation is caused by expectations of inflation. That's their logic. In fact, when you look at what people do, our expectations of inflation tend to be extrapolate what's happened in the recent past. They have these models where you and I are both Nostradamus, either Nostradamus or Jesus. Which one do you prefer? Because we can both predict the future. The idea they've got in expectations is that we have what they call forward-looking expectations. And in fact, those forward-looking expectations converge on a future equilibrium point, which is unstable. I look at the stuff that they've got themselves caught up in, and it's I'd rather be reading Hansel and Gretel. At least the plot makes more sense.
It does mean that collectively, all we need to do if we want interest rates to come
expectations
down,
lead, they actually follow.
All we need to do if we want interest rates to come down is we all just need to go like this and go, interest rates come down.
Yeah, it's an theory of. Yeah, I know.
It will happen.
If we all think they're going to fall, they're going to fall. Expectations are vital, but they're not rational. And this is what they call rational expectations is actually the capacity for accurate prophecy. That's what they think we've all got. And in fact, in the real world, it's so bloody confusing. We react to what's happened in the recent past. So adaptive expectations, which neoclassicals spent the last 40 years driving out of the economic analysis, that's actually what you look in the real data, that's what you tend to see. People extrapolate what's happened in the recent past, they expect it to continue. It never does. And that's why we get part of the reason we get the cycles. But expectations are not fulfilled, whereas in the neoclassical model, expectations are accurate.
So here's an interesting point to finish on, and it is sort of related to wages. That in New Zealand, the central bank did panic a bit and push up interest rates quite high, faster than anybody else, just about. And they now find themselves in a situation where the unemployment rate is 5.2% second quarter of this year, which is higher than most other places. So 4.3% in the US, 4.5% in Australia, which should assume very similar economy in many ways. It's even higher than the United Kingdom. Their growth rate year on year is 1%, which is one of the lowest that there is. The bank rate at the moment is 5.5% compared to, for example, 4% in the UK or 3.6% from the Fed. So way up there. And their inflation rate is 4%. So it's higher than anybody else's as well. So for all of this hard work that they've done by pushing interest rates up, what they've got is still got very high interest rates, very high unemployment rate, very low growth rate, and a high inflation rate. They've not achieved a great deal. Central bank failure, it would seem.
Yeah, and this is because they're run by neoclassical economists. And New Zealand really is suffering on that front when you look at the overall data you've done there. It's doing extremely badly by being very conventional as a central bank and as a government policy body. And, this is the thing. If you follow a fictional model of the economy, you're going to end up with real problems. And that's what's happened, particularly in New Zealand.
So should central banks, the point to finish with, should central banks be worried about unemployment rates? They should just ignore it.
No. What's happened in the last 40 years and 50 years in economic theory, in the neoclassicals, is they've been trying to argue all the way through that fiscal policy is ineffective, and you can control the government using monetary policy, and that should be done by independent central bank staff by neoclassical economists. That's been the direction of policy change over time based on a set of models which are delusional. So, in fact, fiscal policy is effective. You should be using it more than is being done to vary economic activity, and the government should be creating money. But interest rates tend to put up costs. And also increase income, because when you put the money on bonds, that's actually pumping money into the economy. So they think they're reducing demand, they're actually increasing the rate of growth of the money supply with these higher interest rates. So they're actually undermining their own theory, because, again, they do not understand money creation. Some central banks have got some staff who do. That's, I quote the Bank of England and the Bundesbank all the time on that front. But the people who do the macroeconomic policy aren't part of that perceptive group, and they push these policies forward in the belief that this is what their model will do. But the real world is almost the opposite of their model. So these higher interest rates have actually boosted demand and increased the fragility of the financial sector.
Yeah, it increased the income for some people as well, but not for most people. So there's this perverse way of operating, isn't there? That if they see inflation getting too high, or they see that there's too many jobs available, then it's their job to make sure that as many people as possible lose their jobs, because that's going to teach everybody else not to expect their wages to go up so much. So long as, people have hardship, as long as a significant proportion of the population are having it tough, then they'll be happy, because that's going to be a warning to everybody else. I mean, that's fundamentally the way they're working.
Well, they're not conscious. They think they're doing something entirely different, but that tends to be the impact.
Which is a sad way of operating, isn't it? That's for sure.
So they should
ignore.
Delusional people in charge of the system.
Right. Okay. And we've talked before about just questioning actually the idea really of independence of central banks, and whether actually monetary policy and fiscal policy should be working hand in hand rather than against each other. But given that they are operated separately at the moment, should they be paying attention to wage pressures? Should that be part of what they're looking at, or is it all pretty much secondary to what they should do?
It's secondary in terms of what they can do about it, because this is where Isabella Weber's arguments are very useful. She basically says, look, it's the economic source of increasing inflation is contests over the distribution of income. So this is the sort of thing you can handle better through a bureau of the Labor Department and the Bureau of Economic Activity, rather than the central bank, because all the central bank can do is manipulate interest rates, which are tangential to the costs, to the actual causes of inflation. What you want to do is have workers and capitalists agreeing not to bargain against each other over the distribution of income. And that was the original idea of the Accord when I was part of it back in the Labor government back in the 1970s and 80s, was to cut down this conflictual source of inflation. And then the main way, in terms of everybody can benefit from lower inflation, is increasing output per machine, which therefore means you want innovation and investment to take place. That's how you reduce the cost of production.
Which is interesting, isn't it? We'll finish on this, but when we talked about Japan, I'm sure it was on this podcast, I'm sure it wasn't on one of the other ones I did, where the structure of unions in Japan is more based around the company rather than the industry. So the workers and the capitalists work together to try and make their company more competitive than their competitors. And you get that balance then between wages and mechanization and how much the capitalist is taking in terms of margin. And that's a win-win.
And you get a more investment as well, which is a win-win-win. It's
for sure.
The technological side of things, which increases your that's going to reduce your cost of production more than anything else. So if there's competition over the distribution within that company, but in such a way that it encourages the company to innovate, then, you're going to get a higher rate of innovation and therefore a lower rate of inflation.
All good. We should pay more attention to the Japanese, clearly, in lots of ways. Good to talk, Steve. We'll catch you next time.
Okay, Matt. Yeah.